Welcome to 21st Century Saints, our podcast and live stream series for members and those affiliated with and those adjacent to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in the United Kingdom and around the world. I'm your host, Jane Christie. Now, this episode today is a little bit different from the ones that we have done in the past. We recently held a worldwide safeguarding development workshop, and in that workshop, we shared by request, we organised it to share information about our approach, and people had been asking us, what can we do to learn from your approach about how we can see safeguarding changes in the church reflected in our area. So we wanted to have conversation, be a safe place to ask questions, and we had a lot of fun. So I really appreciate those of you who came along to do it. But because some of the people who have asked to see the video and have asked us questions are not members of the church, we wanted to give some bonus content. So that means I'm going to offer some explanatory notes about perhaps something that we're discussing from a non-member point of view, but also if you were at the training and if you were, or if you weren't, just this is some bonus content that we hope that you will find really helpful. The 21st Century Saints team are made up of members of the church and people who have disaffiliated from the church. It's a fantastic team who I love, and we see our views reflected in our audience. So we have really faithful church members, very conservative, even leadership in the church reflected in our audience. We also have non-members in our audience, and we also have people who don't engage with Mormonism anymore and find its teachings and methods to be problematic. So we reach out across the whole Mormon spectrum, which is kind of unusual in this space. Now, it's important before we begin to know that church structure is very, very rigid. While faithful members of the church would see that God speaks to a prophet who communicates God's will to leadership, which then disseminates throughout the world to membership, that leadership, people who hold the priesthood are men, so it's a very male-centric priesthood, very patriarchal. That locally, at a local level, we have wards, which are reflective of church congregations. They are presided over by a bishop. We also have a group of wards come together as a stake, which is reflective of a diocese, and they are presided over by a stake president. But ultimately, the people who make decisions in the church are the first presidency of the church and the quorum of the 12 apostles, and they are based in Utah in the USA. So that's what church governance looks like, and it's perceived by faithful members of the church that change doesn't happen. God doesn't change, therefore doctrines don't change, and perhaps policies may change in response to needs at a particular time or local needs, but activism is most certainly discouraged and frowned on, as we talk about later in this presentation. So that's some information and some background for non-members about what we're doing tonight. Now, the other part of the bonus content is for people who maybe you were at the presentation. We've got some extra stuff for you here. And if you weren't, hopefully you will find this interesting, because as we reviewed the work that we have done, with the safeguarding training workshop, we felt that it would be really useful to add in a little bit of context about our aims and how we and who we asked to speak, and how we approach this work, because it's really relevant to the main things that we were asking you to learn. It was my intention that I would be popping in throughout the workshop to be able to give some context and some information. I'm going to ask that you guys can forgive me that this isn't going to look like that. My family have got some pretty intense needs at the moment. The joys of being a mother of a disabled child. All is very, very well, but I'm needed quite a lot at the moment. So what I'm going to do is give you some contextual information now that you can take with you going into the program. Now, the important thing that I want you to think about going in is that we were asked to talk about our approach and what we can learn. Now, a few people have, throughout the work that we've done, got in touch to tell us how they think we should do things differently. And that's awesome. But we were asked to speak about our approach and what we did, um, and what would be helpful for you to know. We also, to be blunt, have no intention to spoon feed people. Our friend Peter always says, break it down, because people don't listen. People can be really, especially leaders in the church can be really, really stupid because we just have all of these assumptions. I don't have time to waste on that. This subject is too important. It requires you to educate yourself, not to expect victims, especially, to do that for you. It requires you to engage in work. So, with that, while we have a lot of data and statistical information, that information is still being both gathered and will start to be compiled. Now, we do have some snapshots of data. Any information and data that you get about abuse needs to, as far as possible, be looked at in the context of the faith organization that you're in, or religious settings in general, or whether it's gender specific or these types of things. But we see Mormonism sees abuse play out in particular ways that are unique to this faith community, in the same way that other faith communities have unique situations in their experience. And we also, I guess, all have our own strengths in these situations too. But when it comes to finding out what you need to know, you have to be prepared to do the work. Now, one of your first ports of call for that should be to look at government guidelines. And we have an organisation that we work with called NWG, who both help with information about guidance and best practice, but also are able to feedback and engage in work where they're able to amplify the voices of victims. We use them as an example of what you should be doing in your first steps. So, providing data is not what 21st Century Saints is best placed to do. You have to go to the people in your area who are engaging in this work, who are working with victims, who are working with government organisations, who are statutory and voluntary organisations who are working, and you need to be prepared to listen. Now, it sounds incredibly patronising, but quite a lot we hear from people who project, which is fine. We all have our biases. We have, we hear a lot from people who would like us to be angrier, or who we are too angry for. We never seem to hit the balance for some people, and that's okay, because we don't have to, because you're not necessarily who we're working with. We are working to make changes and to build relationships across a spectrum. So our first speaker, Grace, is a perfect example of an organisation which we collaborated with in order to do just that. And it begins with looking at your own personal biases. Grace reflects a story where she understands nuance, she understands evolution and journeys, and she was not only able to apply that to other people and listen to their needs, but she also did what we need to do in this space, which is understand what your own biases and your own triggers may be. For example, we use background checks as a sort of illustrative way to talk about this. When something like this happens in the UK, there are other biases that will become a real issue in countries like the US and, perhaps some other really sort of conservatively governed countries. Um, this is a really difficult debate, and it's complex. And we will hear lots and lots of people say, you just have to do background checks and you just have to make everyone a mandatory reporter. These conversations are very complex, and it requires you to understand what would be some of the reasons where that may actually cause problems. Now, it may be that, background checks and mandatory reporting are exactly what best practice would look like. But there are conversations to be had there. And that means understanding what someone else's biases may be, what someone else's concerns may be around it, and then understanding what your own are. And there is where we see conversations and understanding start to happen. This is the approach that we took. Now, then, when we speak with David, we get to hear about how I asked him to speak about empowering victims to find their voices. None of these people, by the way, are professional speakers. These are all people in their own circle who have given their time to help us to learn, that we have been strengthened and empowered by. And as usual, David's approach is just absolutely perfect, because he was not only talking about circumstances in which victims and survivors can find their voices, but also he managed to help us understand that when one person speaks, we can all speak. This is a community thing, and that the ability to speak requires a work. It means that we are making circumstances as supportive and healthy as possible for us to get to have those conversations. It's all very well for someone to feel empowered to speak, but if it doesn't go well when they do, then the next person is not going to speak, and they may never do it again. So David helps us to understand that. We are then going to hear from Andrew Bolton, who's a dear friend of the Latter-day Saint faith. He is a wonderful human being. He speaks to another bias that we find in this space, which is when people often leave the church, we might just not want to hear about faith again. The problem is that's your starting point. Everyone in this space in Mormonism, people who have experienced abuse, have experienced it in a Mormon context. And to engage with victims, to use the language, to understand how it came about, to understand what were some of the dynamics of power and control, you have to understand the theological underpinnings. When you're engaging with leaders, often there is suspicion and concern. Are you a friend or foe? If we have a shared language, then that is where we begin. And it may not be super comfortable for you, but it's the language of the group that you're trying to make change in. So please be sensitive to that where you can. And if it's a bias for you, then maybe think about why that is. And is that something that you would be willing to compromise on or not? And this is the important part of what the point I want to make before we get to all, Nemo the Mormon comes in, and then 21st century saints, we do our thing and we get to action. We talk about all of the challenging things and all the things we've learned. The pace is going to really, really pick up. But we ask you first to do a really hard thing, which is to listen, which is to identify where you are at right now, to think about your approach, and to do the inner work of making sure that you are best placed to do this work. There is no room for ego. There just isn't. Your approach may be that you want to engage in really direct work, and that's fantastic. If protest and if that's your methodology, that absolutely, and we talk later on about how there's place for that. But if you want to know what worked was building relationships, was empowering victims, being shaped by their voices and what they needed. And what helped people to feel safe having those conversations. And not just, that doesn't just mean help victims to feel safe, but help people who are engaged in a church system, who have faith in that system, to listen and to analyze and to think about what's working, when they have been taught that to do the opposite is worrying, is problematic, is showing a lack of faith, and is perhaps the opposite of what the mission of their faith actually is. To have people trust you requires you to be trustworthy. And so if you can get all of that work done and address all of these biases beforehand, we ask you in this training to do a hard job. My colleague Peter talks about how, particularly when it comes to church and people stop listening, and he'll teasingly say, we need to spell things out to bishops and leaders because they're stupid, they've stopped listening. And I don't know if that's true. I don't care if that's true. I don't have time to explain. I don't have time to break down the laws. I don't have the ability to break down the laws for you in your area. I don't have the ability to help you understand what it is that you need to change about your thinking, or that you need to be empowered and encouraged about in your thinking. I don't know what you need to change about your approach, if you need to change anything at all. I don't get to do the work for you. I have no right to do that. But you have to. And so this workshop is calling you to engage and not just take to the streets and protest. The time may come for that. The time possibly has come for that. We've seen that. Now we are ready to build. If you want an organization to be healthier, then standing outside and throwing rocks at it's not what we have found is helpful for anyone, except for someone who's angry in that moment, and who, it's, if you're angry, it's completely understandable and you have a right to that. And if that's the approach that you want to take, then we bless you. What we have learned is that this works. So if you do have anything that you want to ask us more about, then we're absolutely here to listen. I think we make it super clear that this is about handing the reins over to you. And that's what we want to hear about. While we have been in this journey for a relatively short space of time, this timeline has been like a roller coaster. We have been empowered. We have been devastated. We have changed and we have learned. I hope we will continue to listen. And we invite you to step into this space and be able to do the same. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It means a lot to us that you guys know how important this is. We really honour that. Just a reminder about the housekeeping, we've already been through that. Peter's going to continue to remind you of these things in the chat. So part one, what we're going to do is we're going to kick off here with our first couple of speakers. Part one is about interfaith justice and policy. And we're going to hear first from our friend Bina from the National Working Group. Then we're going to hear from Grace Poole from Sunstone, and then David Sheppard. And we're going to, instead of having the panel discussion, then we're now going to have that at the end. I just want to introduce Bina quickly. So unfortunately, she hasn't been able to join us in person because as the faith lead for NWG, National Working Group, she surprisingly does practice her own faith, and it is a Sunday, and the audacity of someone who might actually want to go to church today is just shocking. But Bina has been one of our people that as 21st Century Saints we work with to get support and to gain information and to develop relationships. So Bina has a background in police forensic intelligence analytics and experience in assisting high-profile police investigations. She works alongside safeguarding partnerships and national voluntary sector organisations to assist in the empowerment of multi-agency responses to exploited children and young people. So with that, we're going to hand you over to Bina. Now, what I want you to just keep in mind, and this is the first and hopefully only main problem we're going to have tonight, the audio is not good on this at all. So, but this hopefully will be the only audio issue that we have tonight. So if it's okay with you, Peter, are you able to share your screen and then we can hear from our friend Bina?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. My name is Bina Palmer, and I am here to talk.
We'll just reopen it. It'll just take one moment where this is our first ever workshop.
If everyone
like
make sure
this.
they're muted.
So what do I decide? There are the three clones here.
Talk about the importance of safeguarding in the faith sector. For almost a year now, the NWG has been supporting the 21st Century Saints team with their journey to ensure that safeguarding is a priority for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We congratulate the team for their tenacity, passion and commitment to ensuring that children in this community are better protected and survivors are heard and supported. So who are we? The NWG Network is a national charity tackling child exploitation, and we're made up of around 14,500 professionals ranging from all sorts of different sectors, including the faith and sports sector. We promote partnership working because safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. We ensure that we share practice across the board, and we do this through providing a platform such as forums, seminars and conferences. We support operational practitioners with casework, and we offer strategic support as well. We have a knowledge hub which contains thousands of resources, and I will talk to you a bit more about that later on. Our network covers voluntary and statutory services and private companies working in this field. We offer support, guidance and raise the profile. We provide updates, training, share national developments, influence the development of national and local policy informed by practice. So the NWG were very fortunate in that in April of 2022 we were able to recruit a national faith role, and this role has been funded by Porticus in the recognition that the faith community perhaps needs some support around safeguarding due to high profile cases that we've all heard about. So our faith lead is Pav. Pav is currently on maternity leave, so Maria and I are covering that maternity post. The role is aimed at raising awareness, knowledge and capacity amongst the faith community in the field of exploitation. We bring together practitioners from the faith sector on a quarterly basis to discuss these issues. And our next quarterly forum is taking place on the 14th of September online on Teams from 10 till 12, and we welcome as many of you as possible to come along to network and meet like-minded people. We are also holding a special event on the 16th of November from 10 till 3 in relation to position of trust legislation, and this is to mark Interfaith Week. Again, we welcome as many of you as possible to come along to that event. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how the role of faith can be a protective factor in communities. The term community is used in multiple ways. This is supported by evidence relating to the child sexual abuse inquiry. Faith can provide belonging, identity, safe spaces and support, hope and positive trusted relationships. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse stated that, as we have said in other investigations, what marks religious organisations out from other institutions is the explicit purpose they have in teaching right from wrong. The moral turpitude of any failing by them in the prevention of or response to child sexual abuse is therefore heightened. The religious organisations and settings examined in this investigation have a range of theological beliefs and practices. Respect for a diversity of beliefs is a hallmark of liberal democracy. However, freedom of religion and belief can never justify or excuse the ill treatment of a child or a failure to take adequate steps to protect them from harm. The Truth Project, which concluded in October 21, gave more than 6,000 victims and survivors of child sexual abuse an opportunity to share their experiences with the inquiry and put forward suggestions for change. This listening exercise was set up because the inquiry recognised that victims and survivors could provide a uniquely informed contribution to understanding and learning from past mistakes and improving child protection in the future. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse found compelling evidence that those in positions of trust have a significant and even dominant influence on the lives of millions of children, often engaging a large proportion of a child's time outside of their full-time schooling, including through tuition in religious and cultural studies or national curriculum subjects, alongside social and leisure activities. Religious settings and sports clubs provide education and activities for children, and the staff and volunteers in these settings are often seen as trusted and influential adults by the children they work with. They may be the first adult that a child reports abuse to, and therefore have an important role to play in protecting them from harm. The government amended the Sexual Offences Act 2003 legislation to prevent adults from sexually abusing 16 and 17-year-olds, where the adult holds a position of trust over them, such as sports coaches and religious leaders. These adults are particularly influential in a child's life and are often well respected and trusted members of their communities. Children will often place their trust in these adults, sometimes resulting in those in a position of trust exerting power and control to abuse them. The NWG is pleased to have been involved in and contributed to the Ministry of Justice review, which found particularly strong evidence for taking action to extend the position of trust offences to individuals, teaching, training, coaching, instructing and supervising young people within religion and sport. As I've already said, the Truth Project engaged over 6,000 victims and survivors. They told us that they need to feel believed and feel like they are being believed. They need to feel that they will be protected and not ignored. They need to feel that their protection will not be compromised by the protection of the institution and those in control within those institutions. One victim/survivor said, "To be listened to and believed has lifted so much from my shoulders. I feel today is the start of the rest of my life." Another said, "Society needs to change. Small signs that something is wrong cannot be ignored." And another one said, "We may never completely stop abuse, but we can stop turning away and closing our eyes and ears to it." We need to work together and take positive steps forward to safeguard and protect our children. We can help faith communities become better equipped to prevent, recognise and respond to child sexual abuse. We believe that faith communities have a key role to play in protecting children and young people and tackling abuse. We have talked about the challenges and barriers, but we want to equip you with some practical information about what is needed in working towards a gold standard approach to safeguarding in the faith community. These particular standards have been taken from 31/8. This is an independent Christian safeguarding charity providing information and support about safeguarding. The standards that they describe are governance, culture, having a safeguarding policy in place, ensuring safer recruitment, ensuring workforce development through training and awareness for those working in the field of safeguarding, working safely, and this means agreeing ways to work and communicating safely with people, managing workers through safe recruitment, and partnership working, as safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. The NWG has an interactive knowledge hub containing thousands of useful and wide-ranging resources. The hub now contains a knowledge hub with a specific faith tile. This poster was uploaded this week, and you'll find lots of other useful information here for the faith sector. Finally, thank you for listening, and for the 21st Century Saints team, for inviting us to speak. We wish you all well in your safeguarding journey, and please feel free to contact us. Our contact details are here. Thank you and good evening.
And thanks so much to both Peter for presenting that for us. That was a huge help, Peter, and especially to Bina and the rest of the NWG team. We greatly appreciate them. We will be, as 21st Century Saints, presenting at an NWG event in January, and we'll share the details of that across our social media channels if that's something that you're interested in. Now, the next thing that the next person we're going to come to is our wonderful colleague. I'll just slide across the next one. We've got Grace Poole, who we are also working really closely with. Grace, as she has been really involved in overall Sunstone, but especially Sunstone here in the UK is how we've kind of gotten to know her a little bit. So Grace is the events manager for the Sunstone Education Foundation. She lives in Salt Lake City, where she plans Sunstone events that celebrate all of the weird and wonderful things about Mormonism. So if we could hand over to you now, Grace.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I do the events for Sunstone, which means that I am really comfortable being behind the scenes and organizing, and wildly uncomfortable speaking. So thanks so much for this opportunity to change my mind. Yeah, so I'm Grace Poole. I'm the events manager for Sunstone, which is a nonprofit. We explore the idea that there is more than one way to Mormon. That's our tagline. And we do that by hosting community events. We have a magazine that we publish, and we have a podcast family that we release as well. It's a plug. Go listen to our podcast. They're really good. I have worked at Sunstone for about 8 years, which is kind of a long time for, like, I've been told over and over, every time I say that number, it's like a millennial career, like a proper. But it's been the single most transformative experience of my life. I came on at Sunstone just out of high school. I was 20 years old. So I didn't know anything. I was just a kid. And I sort of like entered into this world where I had to be wrong about a lot of things, which is a real growing experience. And it's tough to, like, when you're a kid, you know everything. And suddenly it was part of the job to engage with nuance and to engage with, like, the potential that I don't know the right way to do things, and that I might have it wrong, and what is the best practice. And so I have grown and changed and learned so much, not just about the community that we serve, which sees the entire restoration spectrum from ex-Mormons to active Latter-day Saint Mormons to fundamentalist Mormons to people who have never practiced Mormonism but just think it's weird and fun and want to learn about it. And I've learned a lot about myself, the way I engage with issues, the way I engage with conflict, and the way I engage with discomfort. So today I'm here to talk about the process I went through from very first encountering the term safeguarding to an initial reaction of defensiveness that, surely we can't have it that wrong, surely that we must not make all of these changes, to actively looking for ways to implement best practices in my work as an event manager and event planner. Part of the Sunstone mission, you can find it on our website, is the responsible interchange of ideas that's respectful for all people and what they hold sacred. And when we talk about safeguarding, we're talking about protecting that value. We protect the responsible and respectful exchange of ideas. And Sunstone is not in the business of creating what we've come to call safe spaces. And I mean that in the colloquial sense, being a forum where your ideas and your values are never challenged, where you don't experience critique and you don't experience discomfort. There's certainly other meanings, such as like an environment free of harassment, which is actively something we try to pursue, but I'm referring to a safe space in the sense of a place where you aren't challenged, a place where you're comfortable. And that's just not what we aim for. There's value in places like that. I believe everybody has the right to create one for themselves, and that's just not Sunstone's work. When I first heard the term safeguarding in a Sunstone UK planning meeting, I didn't understand it. It was just a brand new term. And just like context clues, my gut reaction was that it would detract from the core of what we're trying to do, which is present an uncomfortable conversation, a challenging idea, a difference of opinion, and ask our community to engage it head on. So when I say we aren't creating a safe space, we intend to create a space where folks can come and be uncomfortable, stretch what they know, and engage a conflict in a way that's healthy and respectful. And it isn't comfortable and it isn't easy. And so when I very first heard that term safeguarding, I thought, oh, well, that's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard to make people stretch what they find comfortable and really challenge themselves. And also safe, because I think in my brain I was associating with safe space, which is just not our job. Our work at Sunstone is in hard conversations. It's in bringing people together who might wildly disagree. We have had events where we have Deseret Book sat at a vendor table right next to a fundamentalist group. And so it's this sort of seeing the whole spectrum of Mormonism and acknowledging that everybody's Mormon journey is the correct way to do it. If you're an expert on your own Mormonism. So regardless of where you've come from, you get to say, this is my story, and I get to be an expert on my Mormonism. And we want to bring everyone together to look at each other's stories and learn from it. We're very, very proud to be one of the places where folks from all across the Restoration spectrum, from, like I said, active Latter-day Saint members, ex-Mormons, fundamentalist Mormons, never Mormons, gather and they engage in honest conversation about differences in belief and practice, and not just surface honesty, not, Southern bless your heart honesty, but real, actual, vulnerable honesty. So I learned this term safeguarding. I didn't understand it. It brought up something immediately for me of like a defensiveness that we want to be right. And I didn't want to have learned this term and have to change the way I did things. And it presents a lot of work. To safeguard an event is definitely more work. It takes more time. It takes more education. But so I was feeling really defensive and I started picking that feeling apart. I read a lot of articles, watched a lot of videos. The Sunstone UK training or planning committee did a little training among ourselves, which was really helpful for me. And I spent a lot of time unpacking that feeling in therapy and figuring out what that defensiveness came from for me. What I learned is that safeguarding practices come naturally when you're open to the idea of being wrong. I, along with the rest of the Sunstone staff, believe in not just talking about best practices, but in being about them. So, which is probably why I was willing to unpack and sort of dig into that feeling a little bit more, is because I don't want to just say, I plan an event the best way I can. I want to actually do it. So I've presented with this information that says you could be doing better, and that's valuable to me. I don't want to just say I do better, I want to do better. We certainly don't always get it right. There are, I'm sure, countless examples of how we have definitely gotten that wrong. But when we do get it wrong, we always try to learn and we always try to do better the next time. So I spent time unpacking my initial reaction, and I learned that not only does the safeguarding measures, as I came to actually understand them, not just my gut reaction, protect the values that we seek to emulate as an organization, but that in many instances we were already doing it. In all the research I did, I was able to draw so many parallels between the processes that we put into place as a staff and the safeguarding best practices, things that we just had seen a need for and implemented on our own, and probably sometimes in a messy way and not in the best practice way, but things that were sort of filling that need just because we want to improve. An honest and challenging environment that we're trying to create goes hand in hand with safeguarding measures. For example, Sunstone has a harassment policy and a code of conduct that we keep actively up to date, and we actively enforce it. If there's an event at a Sunstone conference that we need to discuss as a staff, we look at and see if there's a hole in our code of conduct and harassment policy. It is constantly updated, and it has been reviewed by professionals who aren't just Sunstone staff. My background is in arts and crafts. I am not qualified to create a harassment policy or a code of conduct. So we bring in a professional to help us write it and to help us find the holes. As a staff, we discuss plans and backup plans for handling bad actors at events and in online spaces. We decide ahead of time how that will be handled so that if anything comes up at an event, we know exactly how to handle it, and there's no confusion and no mess on site. And we have frank and honest discussions about walking the line between being an open forum and being a place where we don't allow personal attacks and disrespectful critiques, which on paper sounds very simple. To say, you know, we're an open forum and we believe that we want everyone to have a seat at the table. But in practice, it's messy. It can get messy and it's nuanced and it's tough to do. And so we always have, we like to keep regular discussion about what that actually means in practice and not just on paper. Safeguarding practices, as I've come to understand them, protect the nuance that is vital to a healthy Sunstone event and to a healthy Sunstone community. I don't believe in black and white thinking. I believe engaging the nuance everywhere that I can. Unless you tell me that you prefer Pepsi to Coke, which you would just be outright wrong. It's a bad opinion. But everywhere else, I believe in being a little bit right and a little bit wrong, and in openly and honestly exploring that. And that is the beauty of a Sunstone event, is that two people with wildly different opinions and beliefs and backgrounds can come together and say, I'm a little bit right and you're a little bit right, and we're both a little bit wrong, and how do we get better? It's so tempting to engage in black and white thinking, especially presented with genuine beliefs that contradict yours. When someone is absolutely sure about something, that is the opposite of what you believe, it's really, really tricky not to just write it off and say, well, that is wrong because it doesn't match up with my experience. But especially in Mormonism, everyone is an expert. I am an expert on my Mormonism. And anybody else that comes to an event is an expert on their Mormonism. And that is where the hard work lives. And it is hard, and it is work. It's exhausting, and it's so important. We cannot do better, we cannot learn more, and we cannot grow if we aren't willing to engage with the idea that we might have it wrong, or at least not completely right. So when I began implementing safeguarding measures into my work planning events, I decided it's not about creating a space free of risk. That's not something that I can do. It's about giving everyone the equal opportunity to engage in vulnerability to the best of their ability. It's about mitigating risk where it can be mitigated, and being willing to openly look at what we talk about and make sure that's what we are about. That's where the growth lives. It lives in vulnerability and discomfort and honest engagement with things that scare us and with things that challenge us. That is where healthy disagreement lives, which is what we want to foster. And that's where Sunstone events want to operate. We have a lot to learn. I personally have a lot more to learn about safeguarding. I'm excited to be here and learning more. And my therapist will be thrilled to hear that I have plenty to unpack still. I'm sure she's going to love that news. Shout out to Adriana. But I am comfortable being a little uncomfortable. And I think that makes all the difference. So I just would invite folks to try and explore that, sit in being uncomfortable, and be open to the idea that maybe even if you have it right and even if you're an expert, maybe it could be better.
Thank you so much, Grace. As I mentioned earlier, we will be, all of the Brit Vengers gang will be at Sunstone UK this year. And if you're there, you'll get to meet Grace in person too, because she's going to be there. We are very excited about that. Thank you so much. And again, there are opportunities to ask any questions that you may have at the end of the presentations. Okay, we're going to move now to David Sheppard, who is going to, now David is a very dear friend of ours who is a MBACP registered UK counsellor with a background in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He has spoken about the subject of abuse in a slot along with our Peter Bleakley on the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire programme, and he regularly comes onto the show to help us with some of the things that we're talking about. So David, could we pass to you now, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So thank you, Jane. And yeah, like Jane said, my name's David Sheppard. I'm a counsellor in the UK, and I also really appreciate Grace's honesty about being uncomfortable on this sort of very public domain. I'm very used to my very, very, very small spaces of a one-to-one interaction with people. But yeah, I'm grateful to just be here just to talk a little bit about safeguarding and within the Latter-day Saint context. Something something that really stuck out to me. I remember thinking about it a lot during my training as a counselor, was thinking about the space that is sometimes inherited, you know, by bishops and by leaders within the church. That although they're not, you know, they're not official mental health professionals, um, they are in positions where they need to be having um, sometimes sort of intimate conversations with people about, you know, all sorts of different things. So something that really stuck out to me when I was learning all of the sorts of different things that we have to learn about, all sorts of things about safeguarding, about um, theory and approaches to counselling. I realized quickly how woefully under-equipped certainly my experiences of people in those positions when I attended the Mormon church, with how you know, in lots of ways, how unfairly that they're put in these positions where, you know, their level of competency and the knowledge and the um I suppose that the structure that they have to work within isn't really suitable for anyone. It's they've inherited a situation where they have, you know, ratios. You know, I mean, with bishops, for example, in the UK, you know, just say if you've got a ward of around 100 people, and you've got one bishop, and that's one person who has a lot of responsibility, and they've got a lot of scope. Probably have families. They probably have a number of responsibilities outside of that role as well. And you know, it's something that's, you know, sort of celebrated within the LDS Church is that idea of lay clergy, and it's lovely that there are so many opportunities to serve in different ways and different capacities within the church, and you know, you get to learn all these new skills, and it's fantastic. The challenge with it is, with it being that lay clergy, is simply the ability to do the job ethically and effectively and in a way that minimizes harm is something that I spend a lot of time doing. Um, a lot of the work which I've had to do and continue to do sort of to this day is to make sure that whatever's going on in my world and whatever my past is and whatever issues that I have, that nothing of that bleeds onto the client. So if I'm experiencing hardship or difficulty, or there are certain issues that trigger me, or whatever it is, I'm always spending a lot of time trying to make sure that my stuff doesn't go on to the person I'm talking to. So there were just a few areas that I just wanted to sort of briefly mention. I'm sort of referring to um, the BACP ethical framework, which is a framework which um, some counsellors adhere to in order to make sure that they're working as competently, ethically as they can. There are different frameworks, you know, depending on what sort of part organisation you're affiliated with, but mine is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. So the challenge that bishops, or even just people, leaders that have, you know, who are attending church, they're in this milieu of people who they see every week, potentially for years of their life, and they have to work with people in ways that are sort of demand confidentiality. There are boundaries that need to be maintained within the therapeutic space, which would be incredibly difficult to manage if you are, I don't know, if you, I guess if you just know, you know the people who are around you, you know their families, you know their backgrounds. There's so much that we know about each other before we've even started. Um, so the idea of dual relationships, you know, it is something that that we make sure that we try to keep to an absolute minimum, if not there at all. A dual relationship is where someone will, you know, have a connection to that person within multiple contexts. So it could be if my, you know, for example, if my dad's a bishop, it would be a little bit problematic or difficult to talk comfortably about issues that are pertinent to me, whether it's about repentance or whatever issue it is. If they're a work colleague, if they're, you know, if they're a relative of some sort. There's a lot of lines that are just by necessity, because we're all part of that culture, we're all part of that group. It makes it very difficult to be able to be impartial and to for the person who is opening up about things to have that sense of safety, that what they say is and does remain confidential. Understanding when to break confidentiality, and I, you know, kind of breaching into the law area as well, of understanding laws pertaining to when to break confidentiality. In what instances do people need to understand, if this person discloses this to me, at what point am I bound by law that I need to pass this on? The idea of consent, about having, for example, bishops' interviews, worthiness interviews. It's currently a challenge, you know, if they're things that are required to go into spaces such as the temple, where if you need to attend the temple, you need to have a meeting, you need to have this process. So the idea of consent is a challenge at times because of the need to have to see this particular person. So there's a number of things that I'd like to go into, but sort of limited by time. But I know for myself that there can be a friction that exists between seeking help outside of the bounds of Mormonism. Sometimes with that's any kind of mental health professional or therapy or whatever it is, because there's that concern and worry that, you know, that person's going to try to or that person might knowingly or unknowingly steer us away from what our core beliefs are. Something that's just the most important aspect of therapy is to be able to speak openly and safely about what's going on in your life. To be able to do that with someone who is not connected to you in that way, they're not marinating in the universe, the culture, and everything that you're already a part of. To be able to have that freedom and that space outside of outside of that core group is absolutely vital, and it's something that I'd like to see more of, with that I guess that willingness, especially with regards to safeguarding, to be able to understand from different points of view what is it that we can do to make people as safe as possible. And mine starts off, I guess, just with that idea that I can comfortably, willingly, knowingly explore the real struggles that are going on within me, that I can do that safely. Are people more likely to do that with someone who they already have that intimate relationship with, they've known all their life, you know, or is it going to be someone that I guess has that detachment, has that ability to be impartial? It's something that I feel really passionate about, and I think within the space of the church and having those really wonderful connections that you have with leaders, for leaders to be able to be as empowered as possible, to have as much understanding. What are the things that they need to look out for? What are the signs of deteriorating mental health? What are the signs of where abuse may be happening? What are the laws pertaining to that position that they need to know in order to actually ethically and safely carry out their position is so important. And yeah, I guess that's kind of my main message in hoping that with time that those brackets between working within the church, within the structure, and being able to find help outside of the structure is just a very normal process, that it doesn't need to be a toss up between, do I speak to the bishop or do I speak to someone, a therapist within the church, or speak to someone outside of the church. As long as people understand that there is help available for whatever challenges that they're having, and people go to different people for different things. For doctors, I would see a certain doctor about a certain thing. If it's a physical ailment, I would speak to my therapist for a certain issue if it's to do with a certain thing. If there are spiritual concerns, if there are challenges that I'm having within my context, the bishop might be someone that I would want to explore that with. And I hope in time that those, like I said, those boundaries and those lines become more blurred, in a sense, that people feel safe enough to be able to explore things within different contexts. And that's hopefully something that I'd like to explore more with 21st century saints, and this idea about, I guess kind of unpacking what it means to feel safe in the therapeutic space, and what leaders ultimately need to know in order to make sure that they're keeping themselves just safe as the people who they're working with. So yeah, that'd be me. But thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate your thoughts. We love you, and we will definitely be following up on some of the things that you bring up. This is the second part where we're going to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of what we've all been getting up to recently, but we're going to step a little bit, first of all, outside of our 21st century saints and Brit Avengers and even Latter-day Saint bubble for a moment, and we're going to hear from again, just one of the most incredible human beings on the planet. Now, I want to just highlight the fact that trying to find a photograph of this man, Andrew Bolton, online is a nightmare. I just wanted a simple headshot, and I have to troll back to what I think, might be sort of 1992 or something like this. So
there's a great one of him, me and Peter.
There is. It's,
so,
yes, and you go check out the Nemo the Mormon page where you will find that. I was looking at that earlier, actually. But I love this. I thought I would just take a screen grab instead, because I think this says more about the man actually than what gazing at his face actually looks like. So this was whenever Andrew was speaking at BYU, and there's a fantastic Daily Universe article about how that was received. Andrew lives in retirement with his wife Jewel, who's just our angel. He's a good friend to us here in the Latter-day Saint community. He knows us at our best and has a pastoral and compassionate spirit for those of us hurting in the church. For 12 years, he coordinated peace and justice ministries for Community of Christ internationally. And so he's alert to that which damages the dignity of anyone. He has also served Community of Christ as an apostle for 9 years. Yes, indeed, you don't have to serve apparently as an apostle for the entirety of your life. Who knew that you could retire? So congratulations on your retirement, Andrew. We've asked him to come speak with us about what a Latter-day Saint theology of safeguarding might look like. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jane. Don't let the word theology put you off. It's a posh word, but what I'm going to be talking about is trying to make sense of Latter-day Saint beliefs and how that would help us protect vigorously the most vulnerable in church activities. We're talking about why, from our fundamental Latter-day Saint beliefs, we would want to protect rigorously and diligently children and vulnerable adults from predators that want to do them harm. The harm might be sexual, or physical, emotional, or psychological. So let's begin with a core value for all Latter-day Saints, Community of Christ, LDS, and so on, the equal worth of all persons. Let me remind you of two scriptures. Remember, the worth of souls is great in the sight of God. Beautiful scripture from Your Doctrine and Covenants, section 18. In the Book of Mormon, Jacob 2:21, one being is as precious in God's sight as the other. You could say love your neighbor as yourself as well. The worth of persons is a foundational Latter-day Saint. It's a non-negotiable. I think somebody needs to mute.
Sorry, I'll just jump in for a second. Yeah, we need to make sure that everyone's aware that they need to be muted. Sorry, if you want to keep going, Andrew.
The worth of persons is a foundational Latter-day Saint value. For me, it's non-negotiable. It was given before the church was organized, given before April the 6th, 1830. So we build the restoration on this fact. In God's sight, we're all equally loved, all equally deserving of dignity and protection. There are no exceptions to this. Thus, safeguarding is not an option, it's a must-do. What about Jesus? What does Jesus have to say about safeguarding? Jesus is the center of our Latter-day Saint faiths. It's the middle of your name, the Church of Jesus Christ, or Latter-day Saints. So the Gospels, I think, are really important. They tell the stories of Jesus, and we see what Jesus is like. And we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and a fifth Gospel in the Restoration called Third Nephi. These five Gospels, I think, are the core scriptures of our faith. In them we meet Jesus Christ, the eternal God, in the flesh, as a human, as one of us. I did a study once on Jesus' encounters with women in the four biblical Gospels for a class of women leaders in Africa. And in every story I looked at, I discovered that the women had voice with Jesus. Sometimes Jesus provoked their voice, got them to speak out what was on their heart, speak out their pain or their questions. On one occasion, Jesus stopped a self-righteous gang of men killing a woman who'd been caught in the act of adultery. I see in that story Jesus as a safeguarder. I marvel that all the women in the stories that I looked at walked away from Jesus with new dignity. All of them had new dignity. Jesus' love of children is even more impressive. When apostles tried to stop parents bringing their children to Jesus, Jesus told them off. Let the little children come to me, commanded Jesus. And Jesus then blessed the children as they wriggled and giggled. Notice in this story, apostles are not always right. Apostles are not infallible. I speak from personal, abundant experience. I often got it wrong. So apostles are learning disciples like everyone else. Sometimes, perhaps an apostle's best ministry is being repentant and apologizing publicly. Jesus, in the chapter before the blessing of the little children in Mark 9, warned the 12 that it was better for anyone who put a stumbling block before a child to have a millstone tied to their neck and be thrown into the sea. If we don't do safeguarding right, it's better a millstone is tied around our necks and we're thrown into the sea. Now, Jesus' vivid language, and this is just one sample of it, gets my attention. Jesus wants us to serve and protect the most vulnerable. And if Jesus wants that, we should as well. In the parable of the final judgment in Matthew 25, Jesus says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me water to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and sick and in prison and you helped me. And we could add Jesus saying this: I was a vulnerable child and you safeguarded me. Jesus is forgiver, savior, redeemer, blesser, and safeguarder. So a theology of safeguarding is very simple. Follow Jesus and diligently, vigorously, carefully protect children and vulnerable adults. Yes, the theology of safeguarding is very simple. Robust safeguarding is central to the restored gospel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for Joel for being with us. That was stunning. So far, we've heard from speakers, and it's been a real balm to the soul. We've heard about theology. We've heard from an academic perspective. We've heard from a therapeutic perspective. We're going to hear now from Nemo the Mormon, who had assigned me to write his biography, and it was tough. I'm going to be honest, it was tough. If I were to be brutally honest, I would say, as I have said many times before, this is the boy who makes me feel like I'm going to have a nosebleed, along with his partner in crime, Peter Bleakley. We don't always agree. We have very different perspectives, but we are also, as a group, very, very good friends. We are we're very close colleagues and collaborate frequently. Nemo is a Brodie Award winner and is an outspoken member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He works with us frequently and has been interviewed on US news about UK safeguarding. So we are going to have a quick chat now with Nemo. And for this section, we're going to bring in Sarah and Ruth, who are going to join us a little bit. Nemo, what you learned about safeguarding since this crazy thing started?
Don't make me follow Andrew Bolton. That's wildly unfair. Because I guess a lot of what Andrew said forms the backbone and the basis of how this all works. And how you can adequately sort of safeguard people within the church, because it's important when you're trying to affect change in any organization that you speak that organization's language. And we have a shared language with Community of Christ, which is why Andrew is able to speak to it so much, despite what you were probably taught in Mormon seminary. Community of Christ are a lot more similar to us than we realize. And so many of the sects of what you would call Mormonism as a religious movement, or Latter-day Saintism, are so similar. They all have very similar core beliefs. And one of those is Jesus Christ, who often gets forgotten. And I will end this little bit of the diatribe by pointing to Ahmad Corbett's recent talk of maybe beginning of this year, late last year, where he decried activism towards the church and said it undermines the doctrine of Christ. But as I've pointed out in my video kind of advertising this, it actually doesn't. If you're spotting a problem, and that problem is something is going on that is contrary to the doctrine of Christ, i.e. you're not protecting little children, you're not looking out for the vulnerable, then absolutely the appropriate thing to do is say something, is to speak up, because that's not going to undermine the doctrine of Christ. That's going to safeguard the doctrine of Christ from the manipulations of men trying to protect an organization rather than children. I hope that was a good intro. Ask away. Questions.
You're a delight. Well, this would be an example of the kind of thing that I, as Brit Avengers, we like to push at each other a little bit. So, Brother Corbett was speaking specifically about activism against the church. Would you see this as activism against the church, and how would you define, is what you do activism against the church?
So he said activism against and towards at various points. So I think it's any activism that is aimed towards the church. It's easy for him to frame it as activism against the church, because that creates a us versus them narrative in which he can push off bad people who are trying to make the church bad. It's much more difficult for him to deal in a space where there are activists who have, they believe, the church's best interests at heart by doing what they're doing. So absolutely, what I'm doing is activism towards the church in that sense, in what he is saying, but it comes from a place of seeing the things that Andrew spoke about, seeing the scriptural basis for caring for others and safeguarding children not being lived up to and kept by the organization.
So with what we've been doing as 21st Century Saints, how are the Brit Avengers overall supporting what this work has looked like? What's our collaboration looked like, would you say?
Sending letters, getting emails worded right, bouncing ideas off each other, saying, right, I'm trying to communicate with this person, how can I effectively communicate with them? We do a lot of talking about how we can effectively ensure that the message that we want to be received is received by local leaders. And I think that's why we've had success here in the UK, where others haven't necessarily. It's about bringing things back to those local leaders and helping them understand. Russell M. Nelson just turned 99. Happy birthday. Is sat in Salt Lake City at the moment as president of this large church, 17 million members. He doesn't know about the 6-year-old who's being abused by her uncle, who's also in the same ward, or he doesn't know about the young man who's being taken ministering by someone in his ward who's abusing him. They don't know about these things. Your local leaders likely do. And so they are actually the key to creating these changes, because they know these people. They're going to have to look in someone's eyes at some point and see the harm and the hurt, and they're going to have to do something about it. And it's helping them understand through things. I keep referring back to what Andrew said, because he laid out the language that we can use to affect this. You go to a bishop and you say, this scripture, this scripture, this scripture, this scripture all says what is going on is not right. So we need to do something about it. And they can't argue with that in the same way.
I agree, and I think that's why one of the things that, and we'll cover this a little bit later on, is why it's really important to understand we need to have a language of safeguarding. We need to have a clear understanding of the theological underpinning about, we're all in the same, they're all in the same space. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seems to do one thing maybe slightly better than the other, in that there has been no language of safeguarding, really. That term isn't one that comes up in conference talks. It has come up once, but in a different context, since really this past year. And talk to me a little bit about what you've learned, and I'm going to ask you to think about the later. So when we were talking about the possibility of sending a letter, one of the gang, Julian, had this came on sort of off the back of Sarah was talking a little bit about bishops' responsibilities, and Julian had said, I really wish I could just send a letter to all the bishops, and that's kind of how that came about. So would you talk a little bit about what the letter was? Was it just a stunt, and what you learned?
I mean, in many ways, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about the 3 types of activists real quick, just to explain
Please do, yeah.
why we did what we did. So I was actually pointed to this by my bishop, so I'm going to dob him in, but he talks about a woman called Chloe Coburn, who is a sort of an advocate for prisoner rights in America. She's an advocate for judicial reform and helping people out. And so she has an interest in making sure that change happens effectively. And she talks about 3 types of people that are needed for successful change. She talks about the visionary communities, the inside players, and the mass movements. So the mass movements, that would be like Sam Young protesting outside Temple Square. The inside players would be the leaders of the church. And then the visionary communities would be people that are trying to live the way that they think things should be. So I've kind of taken that and I've reworded it, rephrased it a little bit. The way I look at it is you have generally 3 types of people needed for successful change. In a Mormon idea, you have activists, you have Zionists, and you have the insiders. So Zionists are people that in their ward, they are living the way that they think we should. They are actively advocating for children to be kept safe. They are making sure that there is an environment in which if a predator were to walk into the building, they wouldn't easily have access to children. That's the part of safeguarding that is everyone's responsibility and can't be solved with a background check. ultimately. Because if someone's never been caught, you don't know who they are. So you've got to create an environment in which children will be safe and vulnerable adults will be safe. So they're the Zionists. They're living that sort of that idea of a place the way it should be. The insiders, again, are the leaders of the church, but they are your local leaders all the way through to Russell M. Nelson, the president of the church. And then the activists, I break them into two subcategories. You've got mass action activists, so people that sign petitions, join large protests, generally a part of big movements. And then you've got individuals or gadflies, which is what I am and what many of us would be seen to be. The gadfly is a idea of Socrates and Plato, the idea that there is someone that is there essentially to point out problems, so that problems get pointed out, because no one is served by silence. No one is served by silence on these sorts of issues. So yeah, so this letter very much it forms a type of activism. So it's the activists, not the Zionists. It's the activists trying to speak out to the inside men, and that letter was in part to put the wind up the bishops and make them realize that it's a difficult situation they find themselves in, because the church is essentially, the church has said in the independent inquiry that bishops are responsible for safeguarding within their area. So the bishops are the ones that are legally going to be responsible for anything that goes wrong. So we pointed that out to them. It's there to empower the bishops also. We sent this letter informing them of their legal liability, but also of their responsibility and therefore power to change the way that safeguarding is done in their ward. We weren't necessarily expecting a national policy change, but we thought if individual bishops would then start to put safeguarding resources on posters, would then start to take safeguarding more seriously. That's how grassroots things work. You get all these bishops who read this letter to go, oh, I don't want to be legally responsible for this. I didn't realize that I was in this position. The effect it had is they all then spoke to each other. They all spoke to other church leaders around them. They all spoke to their stake presidents, and it really kicked up the hornet's nest.
Yeah. So what has being informed about safeguarding, how's that changed your approach? Or has it changed your approach?
Yeah, it gives me we talked about a language. It gives me a language, and I think it gives a lot of us a language to pick up the other side of the equation, to when the church says, so Russell M. Nelson, he's going to keep getting brought up, but he said in conference, a couple of conferences ago, he said, we do not tolerate abuse. He was very firm. We don't tolerate abuse. We don't tolerate abuse. The church isn't very good at defining what abuse is or talking about what abuse looks like in our communities. It's very easy to say abuse is bad. Yeah, we all agree abuse is bad. Do you want to give me any sort of heads up on what abuse in my community might look like so I can watch out for it and stop it, perhaps? And learning what safeguarding is, learning what that means as a word, learning how to talk to other people about that, then gives you that other half of the equation. Okay, safeguarding is preventing abuse through understanding how we keep people safe. It gives you that way to actually, we can all say abuse is bad, but we can actually stop abuse through safeguarding or prevent it.
Sarah has a question, and then what I'll get you to do is to, if it's okay, we'll do some, I'll get you to close with a couple of thoughts, and then we're going to kick it up a notch, people. So get your notepads and pens and questions. Really, really handy. We're about to put you to work. Nothing creepy and breakout-ish to freak you all out, because we all hate that stuff, but we are going to let you know what you can do. Sarah.
Nemo, if you were able to have a discussion on the efficacy of activism with Ahmed Corbett in relation to this safeguarding campaign, what would you like to bring to his attention?
I would point two things out to him. The first, he is the beneficiary of activism. He is only in the position he is in within the church as a black man because of activists who looked for equality for the ordination of black men and the access of black members more generally to temple participation and the blessings of the temple. So he needs to be really careful about how he talks about activism, because he's standing on the shoulder of giants that he is then denigrating, and that's not okay. And the second thing I would say is, what are you afraid of when it comes to activism? I would want to know, what is it about activism that he finds so scary? What is it about his perceived hold on power that he has? What is he so afraid of losing by allowing people to have their opinions openly? Because activism doesn't have to look like people stood chanting on Temple Square with flags and banners. Activism looks like someone standing up and saying, this isn't okay, what's going on in my community? And then all that needs to happen is, if there's an effective way of communicating that to those that can make change, changes can be made. The current system of leadership in the church is designed, in my view, to suppress feedback. That's why if you vote opposed at General Conference, you get sent straight to your stake president. They've created a glass ceiling, and the entire system is designed to suppress feedback. What we need is to use this system that we have of bishop, stake president, area authority, area presidency, general quorum of the 70, presidency of the 70, quorum of the 12, and then first presidency. There's a very convenient little ladder of several steps. And all it takes is for those people to feel empowered to pass things up, and all of a sudden you've got an effective route of communication for change to happen. It's very simple, but it's actually at the moment designed to suppress people, and that's the problem that's the challenge.
Thank you. And do you want to share any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look at my notes. And it's really to go back to Andrew. The only thing I would add to what Andrew said, and how you can be an effective sort of activist, because this is how I build it to people that I told to come. So you're going to get what you came for. This is how to be an activist, is to understand what Andrew said. That is the shared language that you, as an ex-member of the church, as a nuanced member of the church, as a fully believing member of the church, or whoever you are, however you're engaged with the church, the common language you share with your leaders is the scriptural basis or the theological backing for safeguarding and looking after people. That's the language that you can all speak. You can look at the scriptures that we claim to base our entire religion on and go, here it says that we should be chucking people in the sea with millstones around their neck if they start offending little children. So let's not have any of that going on in our ward. So do that. And then the other thing is that the handbook is your best friend, because the handbook combined with scriptures, that is the rule book for this church, club, whatever you want to look at it as, organization, corporation, this thing that we find ourselves in that has its rigid, tight rules and structures. If you understand those rules and structures, if you understand how an opposing vote is actually meant to be dealt with, if you understand the way it can be escalated to the office of the first presidency, if you can understand all those things by reading the handbook, by inquiring, by actually holding everyone involved accountable to the set of rules that they all proclaim and pronounce themselves to be playing by, then you can make change happen. And I think that's what we did here.
Thank you so much, Nemo. We love you, and Nemo's going to be hanging around because if you have questions and or a comment or two, then we're going to come to you at the end. Now, just to stress again, if you all can stay muted, if you need to keep your camera off, or if you need to anonymize your name, you can very, very easily do that in the settings function. We will stop recording for the Q&A portion, but now we're getting ready to kick things up a notch. So if you haven't been familiar with our work, here's our team. You've got me. My background is just a girl who started a podcast. I have a kid who has special needs. And I have a lot of friends who left the church, and it sucked. And so I wanted to have conversations about some of the things that we were talking about in the foyers or out with the church that I think would have helped. They all left anyway. And so I'm still here having these tough conversations because they do heal, they do help. Sarah, give us a shout out. Can you say hi? We've also got Sarah. Can you give us a quick bit of your background?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's good to be here tonight and have this chance to have this discussion. I've been a member of the church about 45 years. I'm the only member of my, well, no, I'm not the only member. I'm the only person in my church, in my family left that has any contact with the church whatsoever. The others walked away many, many, many years ago. Just a little bit about myself and how I came to this, to be involved in safeguarding within the church. Over the time I've been a member of the church, I've had concerns time and time again about the paucity of safeguarding arrangements and the lack of priority given to victim care, the lack of priority given to a gold standard in safeguarding, and have tried to have discussions with church leaders about that many, many times over the years. And it's been very difficult to have that conversation because it's been shut down. It's been like, the priesthood have got this in hand. If anything needs to change, the prophet will tell us. It's all right. We know what we're doing. We're acting on inspiration. I'm thinking, you haven't got it in hand. You don't know what you're doing, and people are being hurt. And after years of not being able to get anywhere with those discussions, Jane and I connected with each other a couple of years ago at Sunstone, and we started having some really good discussions around church, around safeguarding. We'd been connecting online for quite some time before we met in person, and these discussions evolved and grew. And we finally made the decision that we had to do something about safeguarding. So what I brought to the table, Jane brought her podcasting, her community activism, her advocacy skills, her ability to host as phenomenally as you've seen her do tonight, a kind of Wonder Woman style of being able to organise and do podcasting. What I brought to the table was 30 years of professional experience of working within the field of sexual harm and sexual abuse. I've got a degree in psychological studies. I've got a master's degree in social work. I was qualified and licensed as a Home Office practitioner to undertake risk assessments and deliver therapeutic programs for adult sex offenders. And over the sort of 30 years I've worked in this field, I started working within a rape crisis group, which was back in the late 80s, when there was no language to talk about rape and sexual harm for children and young people and adults in society. It just wasn't talked about, it wasn't spoken about. And we were mounting activist campaigns then to try and raise community awareness, to try and develop a language about safeguarding, and to offer support and safety for people that wanted to come forward and share their stories or report abuse. And sort of cut my teeth, if you like, on the importance of community awareness and engaging policymakers and decision makers in understanding a problem. I qualified as a probation officer and social worker and worked for most of my career. Some years I worked for the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is a leading child protection agency in the UK. And I worked with them offering direct therapeutic work for families that had been impacted upon by sexual harm. A lot of work was that around family court, around childcare proceedings, around making homes safe for children and ensuring that perpetrators were held to account and that we could undertake good assessments of what was needed to keep children safe. I worked as a probation officer, delivering Home Office programs for adult sex offenders. As part of that, I was also working within a multi-agency public protection agency setting, whereby I was responsible, along with a group of other professionals, for understanding the risk of the highest risk sexual offenders within the community and what could be done to manage that risk. And that brought me in contact with many faith communities to have discussions about how are you going to manage this person that wants to attend church, and professionally brought me into contact with our church. And to my great embarrassment at the time and the great difficulty I had, our church was actually the most difficult faith community to engage with, because you had to break through so many barriers of priesthood, power and responsibility and insular thinking that it was actually very difficult to have some meaningful conversations. And I ended my career, the last 15, 17 years, I think, of my career, I ended working in a team where we were delivering trauma recovery work, risk assessment, risk management with children and young people whose behaviour was very dangerous and was causing significant sexual harm to others. So throughout all of that, I've done a lot of trauma work, a lot of risk assessment, a lot of training, consultancy. And I brought all those together and said, you know what, this church just isn't anywhere in the playing field around getting children safe. So how can my skills help? With my skills, my knowledge and my commitment and concern around protecting from sexual harm, how can that be used in this space to try and drive things forward in the church? So that's how we kind of got together and did what we did when we decided that the only way forward was to host an activist campaign that would bring the church to a point of fantastic change and understanding.
And Ruth, would you give us a little bit of just your background and who you are and how Mormon are you?
My background. So I met you guys both at Sunstone, which you know, I went to as a very angry, recently decided that I'm out, I'm done. I, you know, have huge issues with the church at that point, a few years back now. And obviously found kindred spirits who cared about the same sort of things that I cared about. From a work background, well, from a church background, joined the church as a teenager, did all the callings. I was primary president many times, Relief Society president, state young women's president. I did all of the callings. My face fits. I was on ward councils and in state meetings when decisions were being made, and had as much influence as a woman can have within those capacities. But so I know those sort of the games that go on, and I know the conversations that go on in those rooms as well, and I know the limitations and the hearts of some of those people that sit in those rooms. Because with the best will in the world, local leadership are there for maybe 5, 6, 7 years in any particular role, and then we'll move on and be wearing a different hat. And they're making a huge sacrifice, personal time, work time, all of those things to be in those positions, and do it with all of the sort of pride and pomposity that we have as Mormons, because we think we are there with the you know, being given the permission from God to do this role, that we are the best person for that role. We get told that, somebody puts their hands on our heads and tells us that. So then when we're having these sorts of conversations and saying maybe it could be better, I understand why that's really challenging, because I've sat in a place of belief and would have found that very challenging to hear. However, in my day job, I worked for many years in school settings with what over in the UK we would call primary age children, so from 4 through till maybe 11. My husband's a teacher and is senior leadership in a special needs school and sees kids through from 3 to 19. And deals with very complex needs, and deals with supporting families and working with social services. So I'm around those sorts of conversations a lot. And like Sarah, and I'm sure like Jane as well, saw the huge disconnect between what I felt was good practice and what I knew to be good practice in a work setting, and what we thought was okay in our church, with our church heads on. And I, even down to the actual physicality of the buildings, I had huge problems with the way that we just put everything on trust that the people within that building were good people that meant no one harm. And I often bang the drum. You know, I've worked with children, I recognise how very vulnerable children can be, but I often bang the drum, especially in the bigger conversations that we're having, that safeguarding and vulnerability stretches cradle to grave, because we see in church especially a lot of people who are very vulnerable, who are adults, but fall into categories of vulnerability and definitely need protecting from a lot of the structures and the influence and the pressures that they will find themselves in Mormondom. So there we go.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, we're kicking it up a gear. We spoke a little bit about our personal stories. We got here basically building those relationships where you're hearing a Sunstone link through this is how we all kind of connected, although we're online. Sunstone in a lot of ways, the main way, brought us together. And Sarah immediately is using a language that I love, which was empowering and exciting. And although we had wanted to focus on the subject of abuse, Sarah had this expertise, and Sarah is having conversations with us saying, right, what we need to do is what we need to do is we need an episode where, and so immediately Sarah's first a background resource, and then we're sort of like, okay, no, this is huge. Sarah really knows what she's talking about. And we were able to sort of lift each other, as we do in the Brit Avengers, to these incredible heights that we can get to. Ruth joins the team and is such a value member of the team because of her ability to look at you know, sort of the 300-foot view, you know, whenever you're just a little bit too close to it. And because church membership means a lot to me. And I really, really want to believe the best. And sometimes we need to have those views kind of challenged. And yeah, we got here because there was a work to be done. It's clearly identified throughout the world. Everybody knows this. We have all seen the media coverage, but in the UK, it didn't seem like we had that level of people coming forward, particularly with an LDS background. But the thing is, we started talking about safeguarding because we knew there were situations that weren't necessarily about, you know, those big types of stories, but we knew there were things like bullying, there were issues related to domestic violence, concern about, you know, financial transparency and financial decisions that our elderly people in the church are making that is perhaps you know, that perhaps other views are taken into account as they're making those decisions. They're maybe not always as empowered as possible. Then we have our disabled community, all sorts of people who fit into that vulnerable category that when we talk about safeguarding, that's what we're talking about. This is more than one demographic of children and children being exploited. And as much as movies want to sort of glorify one particular, it's happening somewhere else, and there needs to be a big explosive action sort of thing that happens around that to bring attention to it. What we notice is that everybody in the wards tend to know about it, and there's a sense of discussions that are happening in the background, and we're kind of trusting that someone's got this, but we don't really know. So we started having these discussions, and when we started podcasting about it, people started coming forward. They started sharing their stories, and pretty quickly we were speaking with, and I think about one survivor in particular whose story has not yet been told in its entirety, or, you know, even some sort of real aspects of it that are just so important to justice and to the church's ability to keep people safe in the future. We are really aware that we want to make sure that the landscape is as safe as possible for people like the person that we've been talking about, to be able to come forward and share their story. Because what happens when someone comes forward is immediately people are picking sides. Someone is saying there's a problem and there's a danger in the church, and so there is a threat, and immediately we jump to okay, we have to quarantine that threat. We need to make sure it doesn't get out, because I know this is a serious subject, but is it really, there's an attack on the church? Is it an attack on my faith? The church is perfect, and this cannot happen in our church. We're going to break down our approach a little bit here. This is really important. We focus on survivors first. Everything that we do is informed by victims/survivors of abuse, specifically in the church. When abuse happens, it plays in the church, it happens in a particularly Mormon way. There are power dynamics that don't happen out with that don't happen in other communities. There are relationship dynamics, there are conversations that are happening, there are theological underpinnings that can make us more vulnerable. So we have to listen to those survivors. And a survivor's first approach means that we don't come up with an idea about here is what we think we need to do to support survivors. We put them first. We have to have that listening approach. Bina talked about a listening, you know, an entire inquiry where there's this huge listening exercise. You're just telling me, what is it I need to know? What is it I need to understand? Because we all have these blind spots. Really understand what people need to hear from you. That is, I believe you. Victims, don't all leave the church. Many of them stay in the church and feel safe in the church and would like that to continue. Many people have left the church and they don't want to ever go back to that, and it can be really traumatic to have discussions around what the church should be doing better, because you just don't want to think about that anymore. So we need to not make survivors and victims part of our agenda. The next really important part, and I'm going to bring Sarah in for this, is we need to know the laws. And the reason why we're doing this worldwide training workshop is because you need to know your laws. So let me give you just a quick example of what I mean by this. I had absolutely no idea when I first started this work. I kind of thought there's, the governments are keeping an eye on things. Laws can always be improved, but we know there's a sense of something somewhere. Someone must be looking out for vulnerable groups, right? Well, there was a recent law that had come into place in the UK, and it was in relation to possession of trust. And when I'm hearing about this law, and Sarah's telling me more about it as we're having conversations, I realised that actually within our church, we are particularly vulnerable. We need bishops to be very aware of that law. And that led to conversations about, well, hold on, if bishops are likely to be completely unaware of this law, do they really know what safeguarding responsibilities they have? So Sarah, could you speak a little bit about knowing the laws, how important it is to know in your area? And you're on mute, girl.
Yeah, thank
there we
you.
go.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. The very first thing that you need to do, because what we want to see is whatever part of the world in which you live, if you are part of Mormonism in any way whatsoever, we want to see you able to talk to the church about making the church a safer place. And the first thing you're going to have to do in order to have that discussion that's going to be effective and listened to is to know what the law says in your land. What are the laws around safeguarding, child protection, abuse? What are the laws about reporting abuse? What are the laws about training, about doing background checks, about who can work with children? What are the laws about how you handle abuse concerns? So know what the laws are. The best way of identifying the laws is to contact other agencies and have those discussions, which we'll talk about later. The other thing you need to know is what is the policy and procedures? What does your government recommend should be best practice in safeguarding? And every government, certainly within most of the countries, are going to have some kind of statement about this is what we expect groups that work with children or vulnerable adults to do in order to prioritise safeguarding. So understand what are the best practice, what do they say you should be doing to make your community church a safer place. And when you know what those are, when you know what the laws are, you know what the best practice is, you know what the experts are saying, you've got that research, you've got that information in front of you, that's when you can start putting that together in a document to the church to say, this is what we understand, this is what we're not seeing happening in the church, and this is how we think you could usefully develop some safeguarding policies that would reflect this.
So give me an example about the one that I was just mentioning there, and this is just picking a random one. Possession of trust.
Position of trust.
Talk to me about what happened there.
Okay, well, position of trust at one point only related to school, sports clubs. It didn't actually extend to religious communities. But following a lot of the work done by people that were part of the independent inquiry in this country that came about following the Savile concerns and lots of high-profile concerns around abuse in this country, there was a recognition from charities working with children, from child protection experts, that actually a really vulnerable group was 16 and 17-year-olds that could be significantly impacted on by religious leaders within a community, within a faith community. So after a lot of work, debate, discussion with government, discussion with lawmakers, which is why relationships we're going to talk about later is so important, the law was changed and extended, and only in July last year it was extended to include faith communities. So you've now got a situation which is very relevant to our church, in that they use very frequent, and they use young adults at 18, 19, 20 years of age to be counsellors, supporters, teachers at youth events, youth activities. And if any of those leaders were to have a relationship with a young person aged 16 or 17, that could be seen as a position of trust offence, because they should not be entering into even a consensual relationship with somebody at the age of 16 and 17. And that's something that the church need to really think about with who they are calling to be youth and camp and EFY leaders. Who are they calling to be those leaders? And how are they training them to understand that you might be 19, or that girl might be 16, 17, but you cannot have a relationship because you are in a position of trust as her youth leader.
Right. And that's an example of one particular law that we're sort of noticing, okay, there's a really big hole in that there that no one seems to have looked at or be addressing. And so what else is there? The Brit Vengers, as we were learning from Sarah, who signposted us to a ton of resources, had to learn and become experts in this ourselves, but not just on our own. This next part about building relationships is one of the most important things I think that you need to know about safeguarding. So this is not you flying solo. Building relationships means that you're using anyone who has resources that you can utilize. So, for example, we work with NWG, we work with an organization called 318, NSPCC. There are all sorts of organizations throughout the UK who are best placed to identify what are potential risks, and even specifically within churches. Often, we've just met a faith lead. 318 just specifically look at faith communities. So many churches are signed up to that. Surprisingly, ours isn't. So what does somebody else have at an organizational level that you can learn from? Now, in addition to that, you get advocacy groups who are doing things to improve laws. You will want to think about reaching out to them, because often they're pointing out holes in the system that people, cracks that people are falling through, that you will want to be aware of. You need to know these things so that you can point them out. And most importantly, and this is one of the things that we're going to come back to, in a second, is amplifying their voices. So you're amplifying the voices of survivors. You're working with other experts. You're working with decision makers. You need to contact and build relationships with everyone. Sarah hasn't been out of meetings since last September with lawyers, with people who are making those decisions and people who are doing the work in that community. A lot of your job might have already been done, and you can literally be amplifying exactly what it is they're saying. And also they get to amplify the work that you're doing. Now, in building relationships, something super important here, and you can see this reflected in the 21st Century Saints team. One of the things that we tend to do, and you will notice this, I think we were thinking a lot about this whenever we were considering how people would be signing up to this event, because we want to know, well, who's going to be there and how Mormon or how anti-Mormon are they? So if you're a member of the church and you're thinking about, I am worried that I'm going to hear a perspective, or this voice makes me feel uncomfortable. Nemo the Mormon, Bill Reel, John Dillon, people who we have, it's been pointed out that some of our leaders feel very uncomfortable that we collaborate with. Similarly, if you're a member of the ex-Mormon community, or if you don't affiliate with Mormonism at all anymore, you also may be looking to find out, well, how faithful are those voices who are speaking? Where exactly do they stand? And let me just make this super clear just now. You have no place in this work if you cannot listen to the voices of the entirety of the spectrum, from victims to survivors, to people who are still in that system, to people who have left it. This work requires all of those voices, and I cannot emphasize that enough. I am literally suggesting stop this work if you cannot do that, because this becomes about you and what you need, and you cannot advocate for, for someone if you cannot listen to them simply because of the person who is speaking. So in a lot of ways, we're talking about building relationships where it makes us uncomfortable, like Grace is talking about. Grace from Sunstone is hearing about safeguarding needs that we have identified that, you know, that are concerning to us. And you know, interestingly, at no point in that process were we aware as a team that Grace had even had those wrestles about how she personally was feeling about that. Because she went and did the work. It was textbook how to listen, how to identify what your barriers are. So yeah, so whether you're Nemo the Mormon or whether you are Russell Nelson, whether you are Brother Corbett, if you have a voice and you've got something to say, yeah, if it's useful, I will accept it. If you are not going to help me, then I have no time and we're going to move on to something else. So build those relationships, even when you disagree. That's going to come along with knowing the risks. Ruth, do you want to talk a little bit about the risks of being involved in this work? So I guess what I'm mostly thinking about is the big question. Is someone going to get excommunicated for doing this kind of work?
Yeah, so I think I sit in perhaps the most comfortable space with this because I don't believe anymore. And so to threaten me with a good time of excommunication, it really would mean nothing to me if they said we're going to pull your membership, Ruth. Whereas for Sarah and for Jane, I'm very protective of you two ladies because I know how much it would hurt your hearts if that were to happen. However, what you have demonstrated, what you have exemplified is that your desire to bring about a safer environment for everybody that is in this space is worth more to you than your name on a piece of paper. And I think you have to have that internal conversation first before you decide how much and how visible you want to be in this space, because sometimes you have to put your head above the parapet. Sometimes where you're working at is, I will support, I will clap, I will cheerlead from the sidelines, but I'm not ready to take that risk for a variety of reasons, and all of those are valid. So somewhere in knowing your risks and building relationships is that ongoing conversation with yourself and maybe your close family to say how would it be, how would I feel, how would my heart cope if this were to happen. And I think I feel incredibly privileged to work with you two and with Peter and with Nemo, who sit in this sort of strange space whereby they're having to, on a regular basis, defend their beliefs, defend their faith, defend their reasons for staying, and have the perennial trotted out of, you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone thrown at them. And I see your strength and I see your compassion for those that are struggling because they're not being looked after properly. So I think part of knowing your risks is having that conversation. It is a risk. And I think if you're prepared to say, do you know what, if that's the worst that happens, that I stand like a Samuel the Lebanite on a wall and the fiery darts are thrown at me, or if I have to stand in front of the King Noah and be the Abinadi in this conversation, so be it. There are great anarchist heroes in our scriptures, Old, New Testament, Book of Mormon, whoever you want to, there are both the faithful heroes and there are the faithful heroes who stood up to power, including Jesus. So I think that's part of the knowing your risk, understanding who you want to be in that moment or where you are in your life's journey. And if you're prepared to do it, stepping forward in that space.
And it leads into the, back to the building relationships. I don't know how often, amongst the three of us, we've said, I just wish this person that we are talking about at the time who could help us with our work. Just wish this person could maybe just put their head above the parapet just a little bit more. You know, the difference they could make. And actually, there's a ton of reasons why. So not only are we talking about the risks for ourselves, that, yeah, absolutely, we are very well aware. Historically, people have been excommunicated for taking any action, but also we're not there anymore. I mean, it's not going to happen. And I guess I want people to feel empowered that, you know what, I can't guarantee it. I don't think you're going to get excommunicated for trying to do this. And I want you to feel quite empowered by, look, look, we are here. We are still here. But also that you're going to be working with people who that risk is too much. And you have to be okay with that for two reasons. The risk for them can be earth-shattering. Seeing someone in hospital because they're experiencing a faith crisis is something that we don't want anybody to have to experience, or to support someone while they're going through. This is deep core stuff. But also because under the parapet, a lot of work is being done too. And as Nemo pointed out, we need people who are in all sorts of walks of life. So if you have left the church, if you are still in the church, if you're nuanced, if you're a leader, if you completely disagree with everything, if you want to burn the place down, it's really important that we don't project where we're at onto what other people are. So while it goes for victims, it also goes for the people that you're collaborating and building relationships with. Now, the other important thing is, when I'm talking about amplifying earlier on, we are not amplifying ourselves. We are not at any point saying, and I'm pretty sure that if you look at any media coverage, we don't tend to say, 21st century saints did this amazing thing. And the reason why we haven't said that is because that's not how we see it. What has happened is we have empowered survivors to speak. We have empowered decision makers to act. We have helped conversations to happen. And that work has been something that has spread out throughout the Mormon spectrum. And this is a work that has been done by so many people. The patriarchy hasn't really amazingly come into this little bubble here. We don't amplify what we do. And actually, when I say things like, in this whole panel tonight, in this whole presentation, Sarah is the star. Sarah is the expert. Sarah knows what she's talking about. Sarah has taken us through this whole journey and has kicked ass every step of the bloody way. And she's amazing. And we need to learn from her. And it makes her really uncomfortable. You will never find her talking about, my work in safeguarding has done this. Now, what you will see, have a look at the people who, are online, who do take responsibility. And when I did this, the work doesn't last very long, or it's a flash in the pan, or it's something that isn't going to have the same effect, as you have to amplify the voices of those who need you to amplify it. This is not about you. This is about the survivors. This is also about amplifying the voices of the bishops and the stake presidents and the primary president and all of those people who cannot yet put their heads above the parapet and say the things that you may be perfectly positioned to say. You may be one of those people who cannot say those things yet. And through this process tonight, what I'm hoping that you guys will get to do is to get together and coordinate and find out, where are you at? Who are the people who are going to be able to, speak out in this particular way? Who can amplify a voice in this particular way? And so really focusing on those relationships and lifting each other up. Sarah, while I move slides, you were going to say something. Please jump in.
I just want to say, we spoke a bit a moment ago about the risk of excommunication, and we're still here. They haven't kicked us out. We're still here. They're not going to kick us out. But far harder than excommunication and dying on the hill of safeguarding can sometimes be living safeguarding journeys day after day after day with the church. And it's sometimes harder to stay in the space that is difficult and challenging, to keep having those conversations and keep pushing and keep prodding and keep listening to pain and keep trying to respond to pain and trying to push people into movement and action that have got the power to make the decisions. sometimes it's harder to live on the hill of safeguarding than it is to die on the hill of safeguarding. But the other thing is there is no room for ego in this. And that might sound a bit of a harsh statement, but there is no room for ego. We came up with documents that we gave to the church with suggestions, proposals, plans. They may take every single one of those and act upon them and implement them and announce them in a letter of what the changes are going to be, but they are never, ever going to say, thank you for those ideas. So if you think that that's going to happen, it's not. And it's actually okay that that doesn't happen, because this is about children and vulnerable adults.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're looking for that, it's not going to happen in this space.
Yeah. And I think this the position that we're in is giving us a view that we can tie in and show you all of the different elements that make this work. So having a team like the Brit Avengers, you are going to need your backup crew. Make friends, build relationships, talk about this, and as you talk about it, the language will you will learn the language that you need to know to be able to work in this space. This first section, these are some sort of warnings about working in this space. And I want to qualify this first one. So what we do is not project driven. And I want to kind of explain what I mean by that. Nemo mentioned mass movements earlier. What we do isn't sort of that mass movement driven. It's not, believe it or not, although the things that you might hear in the media are around, we sent letters to every bishop in the UK. We talk about that for a reason, because we want to get attention, and, we need people to discuss the impact. But we don't look at what is this mass movement thing that we can get lots of people behind to support this big event. We'll all turn up and we'll do a thing, and then we'll wait for the next mass movement. Now I want to give a shout out to the people who have done that. Sam Young changed the landscape of this whole subject, and when it came to wordiness interviews. We've also got Floodlit, who, big shout out, are doing incredible work with a very different approach to ours. We also, we've got Ruth, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on her name. Can you remember, who's doing the art outside the temple this week? Can you remember?
I want to say Amanda.
Beautiful work and inspiring. What we do is we focus on those first steps, and any project that would evolve out of that is driven by that work, if that makes sense. So we're having these conversations, we identify a need, and then it builds to. We haven't ever attended rallies. I mean, and those of you who have attended, bloody good on you, keep going to them. That hasn't been our approach. Not only is there nowhere to go and it's always raining in Britain, but it's the letters happened because there was information that those bishops really needed to know that they didn't have. And oh my goodness, we are going to be able to help you with that. So this has always been about, if there needs to be a big thing, it will drive it forward, growing out of the work that we've already identified. So what we would recommend is, don't get sidetracked by if we arrange a big protest or a mass signing or whatever it is. And I'm not saying don't do those things, they have a place, but also they are being done. And to see the results that we've had, it has been about consistent work, not activist centered, it not being about us. We've already mentioned that, but also our biases. We've mentioned that too, that, I am biased towards, I really want to believe everything that my leaders tell me. I really want to believe that you're doing your absolute best. I want to give you all of this grace. We also are going to be working with people who don't, who believe completely the opposite, and we need to be able to just understand that we may have barriers to us being able to work in that space. Think about them. We had Grace, we've got David, who are, therapize their way through this. It's flipping beautiful. So ask yourself those tough questions. And out of that grows the self-care that you need to give yourself, because this is hard work. And shout out to someone like Floodlit, who is hearing these stories. Again, we know the toll that takes. It's a big job. So your self-care should look like making sure that you have people that you can talk to confidentially, that you are looking after yourself physically and mentally, that if you are not right for this space at this time, there is nothing wrong with taking a step back, because if you aren't well enough to look after yourself, then you're not going to be able to amplify and lift and raise this to where you would like it to go. We know what the vision is. We know what's possible. This is completely doable. It should be very, very simple, and it's a pleasure to work in this space, but it's also exhausting. So self-care, super important. When you do this work, you can reach out to us and we will absolutely be here to listen, and ideally help you connect with each other where that's possible to do. We don't know the organisations in your local geography, so we want you to be able to do that work, and we want to hear about it. We really want you to let us know what happens next. But this is the part now where you take the wheel. This is your job to implement in your area, and we know that this is doable and achievable. So we are not going to be showing up in America every time soon to start hassling your state presidents and the church lawyers in your area, but we want you to feel completely empowered to go bug them yourself and let us know how you get on. We do have things like template letters and resources and things like that that we have used. So if you want to know any of the specifics, then we want you to feel free to reach out, and you can do that through our social media channels and our website. But again, just a reminder that what we need you to take away from tonight: survivors come first. They shape your work. You need to know the laws, not only of your land, but of the church. You need to know them better than your leaders do, because you know what? Your leaders, with the best will in the world, they don't know them well enough. You need to build relationships, and people are going to drive you crazy, and you are going to meet some of the best people that you've ever met in your life. As you do that, victims are going to trust you with their stories. So please be aware that there are risks that accompany working in this space, and that you have to look out for yourself, and that you have to amplify the voices of those you are working with. And with that, I'm going to get ready for you all to, if you have any questions, anything specific that you want to know, I'm going to hand over to Ruth to chair. But in the meantime, just in the spirit of amplifying, our best friend Nemo has just done so much to support us. And you haven't heard from Peter Bleakley, who's in the chat, who has been up into, you know, lost sleep working in this space. The people who have presented tonight, they've been part of some of the incredible work that have both supported us, lifted us, and empowered us into being able to do this work. And I don't think that tonight can fully put across just how much those speakers have impacted our ability to work in this space and see the results that we have. The rest of the Brit Venger gang, who are not with us tonight for different reasons, have all been part of this work. And I just want you guys to know how much I love you. You guys who've shown up tonight, you are everything. You're the people who have been taking this work forward for such a long time, and we honour that. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for your voices, but most especially, and I know that you're there, guys, those of you who have honoured us with your story, you who haven't told it yet, we see you, we love you, and we believe you. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ruth, and yeah, let's get this this discussion happening.
Fantastic.
Ruth, this could be, I think your answers to these questions could be some of the most useful things for us to record. So if you don't mind just not mentioning people's names, just give the question, then we can use that. You know, we can share this as a useful training resource for other people to benefit from. Would that be okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
And in that case,
cool.
What I'll do is I'll just do a
final...
I'll
keep recording.
Yeah, I'll do a final shout out then. So we had initially planned to stop recording at this point so that you can feel totally anonymous. So this is just to remind you, You can still participate. We're going to keep recording because we feel that this would be useful to share and to be able to look back on. If you can either choose to exit the meeting now, or just simply keep your camera off and rename yourself as anonymous. It's very, very easy to do. Pop a message in the chat if you need any support to do that. But with that, I'm going to hand over now properly to Ruth.
Also, just everyone, we'll edit this so we won't have your faces and names showing. You know, we'll work out ways to do that when we share it. Okay, so you can stay, don't panic. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I have been keeping a sort of crib sheet of questions as they've popped up. If you pop another question in the chat now, happy days, I'll find it. So the first question that came up was, and I think this is to the whole of maybe Brit Vengers, 21st Century Saints, how much or how committed are the UK and Europe area presidency et al. To the principles that Bina shared in her presentation? So how much do we think that they have actually bought in wholesale to the approach of the National Working Group? Or do we think they are just being dragged kicking and screaming to the table?
I think Sarah would be good to answer that one.
Yeah.
I think it's the absolute honest truth is I think there's a mixture. I think there are some leaders that are very committed and really want to make safeguarding work. And I think that's the vast majority of people. When you talk to them as individuals, they want safeguarding, they want to make it work, and they're committed to it. What we are seeing across the organisation is it's taken them quite a long time to get things in place. Although, in fairness to them, they set the goal line, they set the standards out at the beginning of June of what was going to happen, and DBS checks are starting to come back now. Ward councils are starting to get training now, so there is some real commitment to it. They are working on this. There are problems that have not been adequately foreseen to start with that are going to cause some barriers, such as how you get DBS checks internationally on people. That's going to be a barrier. There's one or two individuals that don't seem to understand the importance of background checks, and those people need to get very quickly with the plan. There are times when you have conversations with leaders who, quite frankly, I think it's a very good job. I've spent 25 years, 30 years of hearing some of the worst things people can do to each other, because I can have the face that's sitting there smiling sweetly while I'm thinking, I want to stab you in the eye at the moment. And I'm going to be honest, I've had those conversations with leaders at times. But I believe there's a commitment, but I believe we've still got a long way to go, and we need to monitor very, very carefully that they are not finding easy loophole ways to make something look as though it's happening when it's not really happening.
Yeah.
Solidly.
I think one of the benefits of being an activist as opposed to serving in a calling is that we can't be thrown off, and benched. We can't be, sort of put out to pasture after a certain amount of time in the role if we maybe are seen to be doing things wrong. So we've got the current Europe area presidency. They seem to be keen to bring this in. They seem to be supportive of it. If that presidency changed, would there be as much? Who knows? But what I do know is there will be people in this space that will continue to be the gadflies, the awkward squad, the ones that are saying, and now what? And what next? And what next? And but to keep moving those conversations forward.
Yeah, and I think what I'd say, Ruth, is yes, I'm serving currently as the state safeguarding specialist, but 100% I am not serving as a do as I'm told and make things easier, don't hold them to account.
Yeah.
The only purpose I'm in that calling is to hold the church to account and to help them to move things forward.
Yeah.
So if they want to do whatever they want to do, they have to crack on and do it. But that calling doesn't buy my cooperation and silence. It just buys an opportunity for me to make a difference with leaders that are generally passionate about wanting to safeguard and protect.
Yeah.
I think it's also super important just to highlight The church did not have to do this. Any suggestion that the church had to do this, it's not accurate. Now, absolutely, the court of public opinion would definitely suggest, of course, you had to do it. But yeah, it's indefensible not to. But they didn't have to, and they did. Where California, Australia, we see areas that have to have particular safeguarding measures in place. Those laws don't exist yet, if at all, here. So that is worth keeping in mind. There is a desire to do it, and that could only come from the pressure that has been put on you, the conversations by leaders, advice from lawyers, and so I think that's why it's important to sort of have chats with a variety of people, you know, all of your leadership, not just the one who's listening is great, but you also need to be talking to the rest of them. We know there are leaders here who are doing all they can, and they are exceptional.
Absolutely.
And no one will ever know how much they have done. But there are also people that I am extremely concerned about, that it's a church first approach, and when your choice is between safeguarding and reputation, it tends to raise some red flags for me. I don't appreciate it, and I think yeah, I'll put it in a very Mormon way. If we know what the Lord's standards are for safeguarding, then we know what's expected of us. If you actively decide to stand in the way of what we know the Saviour's plan is for the world, then what does that say about you? Please feel free to take that to heart if you're listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to move on to a question from one of our viewers in the US, which is there any indication the church will expand the UK's programme into America and other countries? And this person has put, we have horrible safeguarding practices here in the States as far as the church is concerned. Obviously, UK membership is on a tiny scale compared to what's going on in the US and in other parts of the world. And yet we've managed to have this program start to roll out. So what are our thoughts? Could it be applicable in the same way? Do we see similarities or differences in the way the program could be applied?
Can I throw a quick point out on that?
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, if anyone can see me. I think what's going to be really interesting for us to do is look at how they deal with American expats in the UK.
Yeah.
However they're dealt with, essentially, and however they're dealt with in California and in, I think, Pennsylvania, where they currently have to have it by state law. Look at those states. What is the mechanism by which they're doing it there? And just use that to roll it out throughout the US. There's no reason for them to not do it there now. This is the point we need to keep, the drum we need to keep banging. They weren't forced to do it here. They did it here because they saw it to be a good thing to do, and they can do exactly the same thing in America.
Yeah.
There doesn't need to be a law in place. Sorry.
Yeah, and I know, and you're absolutely right to zone in on that. So to give you some context, if you are in the US, we have some wards in the UK, just because of where they're situated, that will have a lot of US servicemen and women over here, and they are attending church and they're being given church callings. That has always been the case. And then suddenly with our new safeguarding policies and procedures, you know, that's a bit of a head scratcher, because people are going, well, how do we make this work? They can't be DBS checked. There is discussions happening about how they're going to do those checks. And my logic is, if those checks can be done for a US citizen stood on UK soil to make them so that they can work safely in a calling and serve and do their church callings faithfully, then those same checks can be replicated over in the States, because the checks are happening in the States for them to be over here. So why not in the States for them to be over there? It just makes common sense. But we'll see. We'll see what they decide.
I think it's really important, and this is why it's so important, that people that want to take on an activist campaign around the church with safeguarding is they know the local laws and policies and procedures and best practice, and they link with local experts and their elected members of government to have these discussions, because that's what will help move things forward.
Yeah. It is what you're going to see, American people who are in this space, worldwide people actually, but particularly America. You're going to see what we're calling DBS checks, background checks. You're going to see that as the sticky part of this work. Now, what will happen is, I think it will happen, but what will happen is there's going to be a lot of figuring out just now, and the UK is where they're doing that work. Now, it is complex. There is figuring out to be done. It would be a lot less complex if the church was working with third-party organisations and looked at the models of other churches, you know, Community of Christ, Church of England, the Catholic Church, who routinely send out missionaries to other countries, and those types of things, those checks do happen. But what you're going to see is you'll see the church, when DBS happens, it's almost like the rest of safeguarding doesn't exist. DBS checks or background checks sit within safeguarding. So do not let this become, you know, the DBS check or background checks become the football in this equation. You're going to want to watch for that and figure out how to handle it in your area. I'd actually be really interested to get Grace to weigh in on this, because this was some of if you're still there, Grace, these were some of the discussions we were having about Sunstone UK. What happens when Americans are coming over to present, but also in the US, what's going to happen when someone has, you know, for example, a background of polygamy, or has lived that principle for an amount of time, and they may not want either authorities to know who they are, or for whatever reason, they just feel like their freedom to not have a background check is more important. And also, the other thing is, we did mention, Grace, if you could maybe speak to this, that background checks are different here than they work differently here than they do in the US.
Yeah, so that is one of the safeguarding measures that we've implemented for Sunstone UK is DBS and background checks for all of our speakers and the planning committee. And it was like quite a challenge to figure out. I think I called like 4 different UK government agencies trying to figure out how to do it, because we're an American organization trying to run them over there. And then we've got all of the sort of laws about running background checks on American speakers. And it just was, it felt like a huge problem to solve, but it ended up being relatively simple. Which is that when we took in our call for papers, everybody agreed to do a background check. So we got immediate like consent and approval. So we didn't have to say that was a set expectation. If you're going to present at our events, this is one of the set expectations, is that you will submit this check. And folks that didn't want to submit that check just didn't have to submit a paper. And so it ended up being really simple. Folks are able to submit for their own checks and then send it to us. So if something comes back that they didn't expect and they don't want us to see their check, they just can pull out and not present, and that is a valid option for them. So they retain as much sort of privacy as they want, and we can also make sure that the speakers that we put in a position of authority at our events have that little extra sort of safeguarding measure in place. For American speakers, it's different because there is such a, I think that the thinking is just different. So from what I've learned from the UK planning team is that it's much more common to have a DBS check done there. It's much less common here in the States. It's I haven't even gotten one for every job that I've applied for. Sunstone did, you know, we work with vulnerable communities at Sunstone. We all run background checks on employees here, but volunteer work, I would never get a background check really. I think I've probably only had 2 done in my life. And there's just an attitude of, I think it's the importance of privacy misconstrued, because you know, we have such an issue with retaliation as far as like legal action being taken on background checks and leaks of information. And so we wanted to be really sensitive to that, because we do have our keynote at our next event is Moroni Jessup, who's the punk rock polygamist. He's fantastic. But because he's been a polygamist in the past, a background check is a really sensitive issue. It feels threatening, genuinely threatening. And not that he doesn't want to, I don't want to speak for Moroni, but the sort of impression is that he's fine. He wants it to be safe. He understands that that's one of the measures we're taking and is happy to participate. But it did take a little bit of like talking through it and really explaining what we're looking for, because the attitude is so different here. It can genuinely feel threatening, because background checks for simple things like minor drug possession can affect your livelihood and your career and your children's lives, and it can be really damaging. And so I think Americans in particular are really sensitive to that fear. And so that was something we sort of worked through, and we were able to figure it out. It's also more expensive here, which is a thing to be taken into account. It's something that we just budgeted for with a Sunstone event, but it is like a legitimate part of that process, is that then there's money that has to come from somewhere, especially for small organizations. And I'm really happy that we've done it. Of course, that's not the only safeguarding measure that we've implemented, but I do think it's made a big difference. And so our folks coming over from the States are taking what's called like a volunteer background check. So it's lower security. It doesn't show like a whole history, but it is the same level as a basic DBS check. So it shows the same results as a basic DBS check in the UK. But it did take a lot of wrestling. So it's not like something that is just sort of implemented overnight and everything's good to go. It's not as easy to do. And I also think it's valuable, and I think it's worth it.
Good. So I think one, and this is maybe quite a challenging question, Grace. One question that was raised was, how do you then use that sort of culture of safeguarding to revisit using materials by people that maybe have got question marks next to them, as far as there was a historian, Tom Kimball, who had allegations of CSA against him, was being investigated when he died. You know, there's a tension there now, isn't there, between, now that we're saying we believe in places being a safe place to be, do we go back and revisit those sorts of things and question what we use as resources as part of safety?
Yeah, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds as far as that specific example, because obviously we're talking about broader safeguarding, but I will say I completely and unequivocally believe the victims in that case. I don't want there to be any doubt as far as that. So obviously that was about, 1 million hours of staff calls, and we consulted with experts, and we talked with victims advocates, and we did talk with some of Tom's victims. He has many. It's really, really gut-wrenching. And it's tragic that there will be no justice there, right? Tom is not here to answer for what he's done to those women, and that is absolutely a tragedy. Yeah. And so that is one of the big questions that we had, is we maintain a historical archive. We have lots of folks in our archive who are bad people, right? People who have done real, actual harm. And that is a really tricky sort of line to walk. So I want to clarify that we don't use Tom Kimball's audio. He was on some of our podcast episodes. His voice was out there on our podcast. We removed it. And then the places that sort of what he was adding was instrumental to the episode, we re-recorded with another voice. And then the places where it wasn't, we just removed it altogether. But it does exist in our archive. And that was sort of the tough thing, is that we've got bad actors in the community. And like I said, we can't eliminate risk. Anytime that you're coming into an event and you're being vulnerable, there is an inherent risk. And so that was something that we really wrestled with. It does exist in our archive. It has several warnings and descriptions of who Tom Kimball was and what he was accused of. And so we have taken it out of use. It doesn't exist in any of our current content that we release, but it does exist in our database, in our archive, as with content warnings and with warnings about who he was. And it's really tricky. And I think that situation was part of the sort of catalyst for really digging into safeguarding and how can we make our events more safe. And of course, several of these measures we had in place well before that. Yeah. Because, safeguarding isn't a foolproof 100% science. You can do all of these measures and there's still can be harm done. Yeah. But it was absolutely a catalyst for the staff to look at how we can do better. And yeah, I think it was really valuable. And I don't know what I would change going back, probably some things, but sorry, Jane, go ahead.
I actually think that this is a really good example of what what a safeguarding process looks like, what these discussions can look like when you're working with an organisation that is structured the way Sunstone is. If only all were so wonderful to work with. As a podcast, as an organisation that is focused so much of what we do on safeguarding, we need to make sure that any organisation that we collaborate with understands our standards, or we can't work with you. You know, simple as that. You need to do a few things to improve. And so we had conversations. You know, as we were stepping, because this is the first year that as individuals in 21st Century Saints, we've been involved in organising Sunstone UK. Previously, it was other members of the Brit Vengers team. It was the other Heaths who are not here at the moment, Laura and Julian. And yeah, so we had questions, and what really interested me is the fact that you know, we talk a lot about the ICSA inquiry. And, you know, all of this safeguarding landscape in the UK, a lot of it was being looked at as a result of a very, very high profile case. An individual who was closely linked with the BBC and therefore had access to children because of his celebrity status and media status. When you go on and look for that individual's name in the BBC, the content is still there. And one of the things that we immediately noticed that Sunstone had done was much, much greater than even sort of UK government inquiries had chosen to act on, and for similar reasons. So we recommended a whole bunch of stuff, because that's what we do. You know, you want to know what we think about your safeguarding? Well, let me tell you, even if you don't. And so we had sort of sent a bunch of stuff that here's what we're thinking, and a lot of those measures, in fact I think most of them, Sunstone already had in place, and conversations were continually happening about that. So I thought that was really helpful. All organisations are on a safeguarding journey, and you want to be very worried if someone is saying, yeah, we do really good safeguarding here, because any good organisation is very aware that there is a long way to go.
Yeah. Right, I've got a really good question coming in from Finland. So, in your professional opinion, Sarah, you know, knowledgeable opinions, everyone else, would there be any value to retroactively reporting past incidents of concern involving individuals who previously served in prominent callings? In other words, what is a reasonable statute of limitations, if any?
I think it's always worth reporting historic abuse. It's absolutely essential historic abuse is reported, because that person may still be in a position of authority, maybe still be in a position where they've got access to victims. The victim who has been harmed and is thinking about reporting deserves justice and deserves their story to be heard, and that's the most important thing of all. It also provides an opportunity for somebody to look at another person and think, are there any other victims that we need to be concerned about? Historic abuse should always, well, not should, it's up to the victim, but I would recommend historic abuse is always reported. Finding out how to do that safely to make sure you get the best response is really important. And within every local community, it's well worth checking out who are the agencies dealing with sexual abuse and getting some support before reporting, so you know how to report, who to report this to, and what information they're likely to need. In the UK, there's different ways that people can do that. There's sexual abuse referral centres across the UK that you can report historic or current abuse to, and they will take the evidence, they will gather the information, and they will not pass it on and deal with it unless you give them permission to do so. Police and medical staff are involved in those interviews, the gathering of evidence, the gathering of information, but it will just sit on their files until such times as a victim says, no, I'm ready for you to act on that. And I think if you do report historic abuse and there is a tragic situation where you are not heard and you don't believe you've been taken seriously, then it's really important to have some understanding of where you get support from and how you can ask for that case to be reviewed. And certainly that can happen in the UK. And we will support anybody who wants to report historic abuse in the UK. We've got networks, we've got links with charities, links with experts. We will support that. but in any other country, please look for the local agencies that specialise in it.
Yeah, and that's a must on the list. You have to know, because
Yeah.
when actually NWG, Bina, who we heard from right at the beginning, when we first started working with NWG, and sort of they're asking us what experiences we're having with the victims who are coming forward, what are they, what are we seeing about prevalence? As soon as there's one, they're making it really clear, okay, if we're talking about a faith organization and this hasn't really been talked about publicly before, if there's one, there are going to be more. And so you're looking for patterns like clusters of abuse, wards or communities where there are stakes where there are patterns of perhaps the same name coming up again and again. You're going to be in a position where you may be hearing about this. So you have to know what is the best place that victims can be signposted to, because you cannot fulfill that role. We have Sarah, who is a bloody legend. We work with we've got David, we've got all of these incredible people surrounding us. You have to make sure that they are treated with dignity and respect, and that where they're going to disclose to, particularly where that's current. Now, the other important thing is historic. Yes, absolutely. Have someone having that option to report is important. Their story, their time, how they want to tell it. But there may be a current aspect of it. So where cases may be ongoing or potentially happening right now, or if you just don't know, but there is the existence of some kind of active threat, then you may want to consider how you want to speak to the church about that. Because often, if someone is an active member, they can be best placed to make sure in that moment that person will not be able to work with a vulnerable person. So if you have information that the church could act on, you're going to want to think about what those relationships look like. So in our case, we've built relationships with church lawyers, where if there is an active risk and a member needs to be removed from their calling, and we need to make sure, or at least we just need to know that ward is that is being managed correctly, we can have that conversation with church lawyers. We also have had, I have deep concerns about the church reporting helpline, but it's also been helpful in some situations. So you want to really know what that arsenal of support looks like. Are you going to choose to call a church helpline to find out if they know anything about it? I mean, you just might want to have all of that information so that you can know how the church is likely to handle it. What direction is this going to take, if that makes sense? So yeah, it's about making sure that you use all the resources.
And I think if you do talk to anyone at church about abuse, and you believe that they have not been fully cooperative with the external authorities such as police, children's services, safeguarding teams, probation services, any professionals, if you believe the church are withholding information and not 100% cooperating with an investigation, then it would be really important to share that. You could share that with us, you could share that with the police, you could share that with a charity, a solicitor, but if you feel the church are not cooperating with the authorities in the investigation of abuse, that really does need to be blown out the water.
Yeah. So a couple of things I think is worth just recognising that people have brought up in the comments is that there is a warped relationship of trust and strength in faith in the Lord, and therefore to not report because we just lean on the Lord. We've all got problems. We've all got things going on. Everyone's got a cross to bear. And that it's about repentance and it's about forgiveness. So that is a culture that is often quite a toxic culture that is associated with Mormonism. And that is a barrier that you're going to perhaps push up against. And it's also because we want to help people and we think we know better than anybody else, including the victim sometimes, it's are, you know, it'd be very easy to tell people, no, you've got to do X, Y, Z, and not listen to those voices, and force them into a conversation they're not ready to have yet. So it's understanding that that dynamic is definitely very prevalent still, but also from the other side of a place of wanting to support the victim, we can push them to be open when they're not ready to yet. So yeah, it's finding the right balance there, isn't it? And supporting them not to put up with that system that exists within the church, but also moving forward at their own time and pace.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to close. I'm very conscious of the time. I'm going to close with some comments that that David made, and he raised these questions, which I think are really worthwhile and valid, especially for people who are maybe sitting in a place where they are a believing active member still. And he said, I wonder how things would change within the structure and the mentality of the members and local leaders if they understood the limits of their capacity, based on the time they can give to their calling, their understanding of their own biases and triggers, and the laws associated with their calling, and what they must do to protect those within their remit. I think that sometimes having faith, having a belief in a higher power, can sometimes stop us understanding our own humanity and allowing us to understand we've got a limit to our capacity, and we've got a limit to our own ability to actually work in a particular calling. And that's not a fault and failing of our own. It's sometimes we've been asked to do something that is beyond our capability, especially people that are serving it as bishops and things like that. It's a huge amount of responsibility, and we recognise that when we're asking them what the hell are they doing to safeguard, and what the hell are they doing to support victims of abuse. And we recognise that they are simple human beings with no specialist experience. So I think he's absolutely right to address that, and to think about how very much more healthy the church could be if people, when they're asked to serve in a particular role, had the ability to say, I don't think I'm a good fit for that. I don't think I've got the skill set for that. Or I might need a whole amount of training and support in order to do that role. I think that could be a much healthier place to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand back to you, Jane. I think I've worked my way through. There's so many lovely comments in there, and I think I've worked my way through a lot of the discussions. But yeah, if anyone, this is an ongoing conversation. You're all in the room together. Make friends, connect, carry on conversations. But yeah, back over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. This is literally how the Brit Vengers got started. This is what happened. So this is what you guys need to do. Make sure you're reaching out to each other. You can also use our page to make those connections, or the Brit Vengers discussion group, or just get talking, and it will come. Thank you so much for all of this. If there's anything that we haven't covered, don't forget you can save the chat. If you want to go back and have a look, you can save that by clicking the 3 dots at the bottom. We're going to turn this into some kind of resource that we can share. We're going to let Peter and Nemo work their magic like they always do. If you have anything specific that you need us to cover, we will get back to you. But just remember, this is your job now. Go take it, go do it. You can achieve this. You just cannot do it alone. So let us know how things are going in your area, because we really want to hear about it. We want to hear what you learn. And we just want to tell you how bloody amazing you are. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And we will see you all online in the very short future. Have a good night, everyone.